3 weeks ago, I drove 4 hours to surprise my son in Portland, and what I found nearly broke me in ways I didn't know a person could be broken at 63. My wife, Lorraine, had gone up ahead of me. She'd been staying with our son and his wife since early March, helping out, she said, because our daughter-in-law had just had a minor procedure and needed someone around the house. Lorraine is the kind of woman who shows up. Always has been. 41 years married to her, and I've never once seen her say no when family needed something. So when our son called and asked if she could come stay for a couple weeks, she had her bag packed the next morning. I stayed back in Medford. We have a small property there, an older ranch-style house, nothing fancy, and the gutters needed replacing before spring really hit. I told Lorraine I'd be fine, told her I'd keep myself busy. But after 3 weeks of frozen dinners and too much quiet, I decided to drive up and surprise everyone. I didn't call ahead. I thought it would be nice. The kind of thing you see in old movies, where the father shows up with a bag of groceries and everyone laughs, and it turns into a good weekend. I stopped at a Fred Meyer outside Portland and picked up flowers for Lorraine, a bottle of red wine, and some of those fancy crackers my daughter-in-law always put out when guests came over. I pulled onto their street around 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I hadn't even gotten the car fully parked when I heard someone calling from across the yard. "Sir! Sir, wait, please!" I looked up. It was their neighbor, a woman I'd met maybe twice at backyard gatherings, mid-50s, short silver hair, always had a little terrier on a leash. Her name was June. She was crossing the lawn toward me at a pace that wasn't quite running but wasn't walking either, and the look on her face was the kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain even catches up. "Please," she said, grabbing my arm right there in the driveway. "Don't go in there yet. I need to talk to you first. I want to stop here and tell you something. Before that afternoon, I would have told you my son was a good man. Not perfect, nobody is, but good. He'd had some rough years in his late 20s, some bad decisions with money, some distance between us that we'd slowly closed over time. By the time he married his wife 6 years ago, I thought we were in a good place. I thought we'd made it through the hard part. I had no idea what I was about to learn." June pulled me to the far side of my car, away from the windows of the house. She kept her voice low. Her hands were shaking slightly. She told me she hadn't been sleeping well for 2 weeks, that she'd been going back and forth about whether to call anyone, whether it was her place to say something, whether she was misreading things. "I almost called you," she said. "I looked up your son's last name and found a number in Medford, but I didn't know if it was right and I was scared of making it worse." I told her to just say what she needed to say. She took a breath. About 10 days after Lorraine arrived, June had been in her backyard in the evening, near the fence that ran between the 2 properties. She wasn't eavesdropping. She'd gone out to check on her garden, and the voices just carried. My son and his wife were on their back patio. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. They were talking about my wife's life insurance policy. They were talking about whether it would be faster if the situation resolved sooner rather than later. She heard my daughter-in-law say that Lorraine was already fragile from the procedure, that it wouldn't take much. June stood frozen behind the fence for 10 minutes. Then she went inside, locked her door, and sat at her kitchen table trying to convince herself she'd misunderstood. That it was a TV show they were watching, that people didn't actually say things like that. But she'd heard them clearly, and my son had laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of tired, conspiratorial laugh of someone who'd already decided something. I stood in my own son's driveway holding a bag of groceries and a bouquet of flowers, and I felt the world tilt sideways. Here is what I knew in that moment without any proof yet, just a cold and certain knowing. Lorraine and I had updated our wills 2 years ago. She had a $400,000 life insurance policy, which we'd taken out when I was still running my contracting business, and we carried a lot of debt. Most of that debt was gone now, but the policy remained. And our estate, such as it was, the house, the land, some retirement accounts, was set to pass to our son as the sole beneficiary because our daughter had passed away 11 years ago, and we'd never updated the documents after that. My son knew all of this. He'd asked about it directly, about 18 months back, in a way I'd brushed off as idle curiosity. "Just planning ahead, Dad," he'd said, trying to understand the family finances. I hadn't thought twice about it. I set the groceries down on the hood of my car. I asked June if she would be willing to tell the police what she'd heard. She said yes, immediately, without hesitating, and I understood then how long she'd been carrying this alone and how relieved she was to finally hand it to someone. I called 911. I know how that sounds. I know some of you are thinking, shouldn't you have gone in first? Confronted him, given him a chance to explain? I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then I thought about my wife, alone in that house, and I made the call. 2 officers arrived within 12 minutes. I met them at the curb and explained what I'd been told. They asked June to repeat what she'd witnessed. One officer went to the front door while the other stayed with us. My son answered the door in a t-shirt and jeans. He looked surprised to see the officers. Then he looked past them and saw me standing at the curb, and something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of rapid calculation, like a man doing math in his head very fast. Lorraine came to the door behind him. She looked thin, thinner than when she'd left Medford 3 weeks ago. She had a bruise on her forearm that she tried to pull her sleeve over when she saw me looking. She said it was from bumping into the counter. She smiled a little too quickly and said she was fine. The officers asked to come inside. What unfolded over the next 2 hours is something I'm still processing. The officers found a bottle of medication in the kitchen cabinet, a prescription in my daughter-in-law's name, a sedative, and it had been opened. There was also a journal on the nightstand in the guest room where Lorraine had been sleeping. She'd written in it every evening since she arrived. In the entries from the past week, she'd written that she felt foggy and unusually tired, and that she kept sleeping 12-13 hours and waking up disoriented. She'd assumed it was the change in altitude or the stress of travel. She'd written 3 days before I arrived, "I hope I'm not coming down with something. I feel so strange. I don't want to worry the kids." When the paramedics came and checked her, her blood pressure was dangerously low. They took her to the hospital. She stayed there for 4 days. I slept in a chair next to her bed every one of those nights. On the second night, when the color had started coming back to her face and she was more herself again, she looked at me across the room and said, "How did you know to come?" I told her I'd just missed her. That was true. That was the whole truth of it. I'd missed her, and I'd bought flowers, and a neighbor with a good conscience had been standing on the other side of a fence at the right moment. That's the only reason my wife is sitting next to me today. My son was arrested that evening. His wife was arrested the following morning after the investigators had time to go through the phone records and texts, which apparently laid out the plan in a way that left very little room for interpretation. I don't know everything that was in those messages. I don't want to know. What I do know is that the messages referenced Lorraine's insurance policy by name, referenced the medication, and referenced a timeline. A timeline! My son had sat across from me at Christmas dinner 2 months earlier and helped me carry boxes of decorations up from the basement and asked me how my knee was holding up. And he had a timeline. I've tried to understand it. I've spent more hours than I'd like to admit sitting in the dark trying to figure out where it went wrong. Where the boy I raised, the boy I coached through Little League and drove to college orientation and stood beside at his wedding, turned into someone who could do this. The money wasn't even the full picture, as it turned out. He'd accumulated significant gambling debts over the past 3 years. Online sports betting, mostly, the kind that's legal now in Oregon, and easy to access and very easy to lose track of. He owed somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000, according to what came out in the investigation. He'd been borrowing from his wife's family, from credit cards, from anyone who would extend him something, and the walls were closing in. He saw Lorraine's policy as the way out. He saw his own mother as a means to an end. I don't say this to make you angry on my behalf, though I understand if you are. I say it because I want you to understand the specific kind of grief that comes from discovering that someone you love completely was capable of this. It isn't just betrayal. It's a rearranging of everything you thought was real. You go back through every memory, and you don't know which ones to trust anymore. Lorraine and I had hard conversations in that hospital room. She cried more in those 4 days than I'd seen her cry in 4 decades. Not just about what had nearly happened to her, but about the loss of the son she thought she had. About the grandchildren she'd been hoping for. About whether she'd missed signs. Whether we both had. There are no clean answers to those questions. I've stopped looking for them. What I can tell you is what happened next. We hired an attorney immediately and had our estate documents rewritten from top to bottom. Everything was restructured to ensure that if anything happened to either of us, the assets would go to a trust managed by our accountant, with charitable provisions our son could never access. We also worked with the investigators throughout the process, providing financial records and anything else they needed. The case moved faster than I expected. My daughter-in-law agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. She testified about the plan, about how it had started as a conversation that she'd initially resisted, then slowly, horribly, let herself be talked into. I believe she was telling the truth about that. I don't forgive her, but I believe her. My son's sentencing took place on a Thursday morning in a Multnomah County courtroom. I was there. I don't know exactly why I'd asked myself that question on the drive up. Lorraine stayed home. She couldn't bring herself to go, and I understood that. He didn't look at me when they read the verdict. He looked at the table in front of him. The judge sentenced him to 9 years on charges of criminal conspiracy and elder abuse. His wife received 3 years probation and community service. The prosecutor told me privately that the text messages had been the deciding factor. The records were specific and time-stamped, and they made the jury's deliberation very short. 9 years. I walked out of that courthouse and sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. I'd run out of tears somewhere around day 2 of the hospital. I just sat there with the windows down in the cold March air, and I thought about the drive home, about Lorraine waiting, about the gutters I still hadn't finished. Life keeps asking you to show up for the ordinary things, even when the unordinary things have split you open. June came to see us about a month after everything settled. She drove down to Medford, a 4-hour trip, because she wanted to see with her own eyes that Lorraine was all right. They sat together at our kitchen table for 3 hours. I made coffee and stayed out of the way mostly. At one point, I heard them both laughing at something, and I had to step outside for a minute because the sound of it hit me somewhere deep. Lorraine is doing better now. Her health has fully recovered. She's back to her garden, her book club, her Wednesday walks with the neighbor down the road. She doesn't sleep 12 hours anymore. She jokes sometimes that I'm hovering too much, that I follow her around the house like I'm afraid she'll disappear. She's not wrong. I do hover. I make excuses to be in whatever room she's in. I refill her coffee before she asks. I stay up later than I used to, watching the light under the bedroom door until I'm sure she's settled. I know it's too much. I know she doesn't need a guardian. She's one of the strongest people I've ever known, and she was strong through all of this, steadier than me in some ways. But I lost her once, almost. I didn't know it was happening until I was standing in a driveway with flowers, and a woman I barely knew was grabbing my arm and telling me the truth. I'm not ready to stop hovering just yet. If there is something I want to leave you with, not a lesson, exactly. Because I don't think I'm in any position to hand out lessons right now. It's this: pay attention to the people who reach out, the neighbor who hesitates but then speaks anyway, the friend who sends the text that seems small but cost them something to send, the person who stands on the other side of a fence and decides that staying quiet is no longer something they can do. June saved my wife's life. She wasn't a hero in any dramatic sense. She was just a woman who knew something and couldn't sleep, and finally decided that the discomfort of speaking up was less than the weight of staying silent. Lorraine calls her every Sunday now. They've become the kind of friends that happen later in life, the unexpected ones, the ones that feel like gifts. And me, I finished the gutters. Eventually. Took me most of April, but I finished them. Sometimes the ordinary things are the ones that keep you standing. I've been sitting with this long enough now that I can say something about it without my voice breaking. What happened to the rain didn't come out of nowhere. Looking back, I can trace the line. The small choices my son made, one after another, each one a little worse than the last, until the accumulation of them became something monstrous. The gambling didn't start as a plan to hurt anyone. It started as a bad habit that he lacked the character to face honestly. And that's the thing about dishonesty. It doesn't stay in one corner of your life. It spreads. It looks for exits. And eventually, the people who love you most become the exits it finds. I don't think my son was born without a conscience. I think he let it go quiet. He stopped listening to it. And over time, the silence became comfortable. That's the part that stays with me. Not the rage of what he tried to do, but the long, slow erosion of who he used to be. The man who sat across from me at Christmas and passed the rolls and asked about my knee. That man had already decided. He just hadn't shown it yet. That gap between what a person appears to be and what they've already become inside is where the real danger lies. June understood something that my son had forgotten entirely, that doing the right thing costs something, and you pay it anyway. She stood in her backyard and heard things she wished she hadn't heard, and then she spent 2 weeks unable to sleep carrying it. She could have convinced herself it wasn't her business. She could have chosen the easier thing. But she didn't, because somewhere in her she still believed that what she did mattered, that her actions had weight, that staying silent made her part of something she couldn't live with. That's a kind of moral clarity that I have enormous respect for. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just a person deciding quietly that they're going to be the kind of person who speaks up even when it's frightening. Lorraine had her own version of that strength, in how she came through the hospital, in how she asked hard questions without bitterness, in how she rebuilt herself after learning what she'd learned. That's not a small thing. Resilience like that doesn't happen to you. You choose it over and over, in moments when giving up would be so much easier. And me, I'm still figuring out what I learned. I think it has something to do with paying attention, with not assuming that love is enough on its own, that it protects people from becoming something unrecognizable. Intelligence matters, knowing when something is wrong even before you can prove it, trusting that cold knowing in your chest when a neighbor grabs your arm and her hands are shaking, and then having the spine to act on it, even when acting on it means calling the police on your own son. None of this made me wiser in a way that feels good. It made me wiser in the way that scar tissue is tougher than the skin it replaced. I finished the gutters. The rain's garden is coming in strong this spring. June calls on Sundays. We keep going. That's what you do. You keep going, and you try to be the kind of person who, when the moment comes, does the right thing. Even if your hands are shaking,